I'm going to sit down to read this. You probably haven't noticed, but I'm old. And I also have a bad back. And give you fair warning, this is going to last right at an hour. So Kate told me I had an hour, from 5 to 6. And, well, I want to give you your money's worth. The late Sir John Keegan, and let me figure out the technology here. Yeah, very good. The late Sir John Keegan observed many armies, beginning as crowds, remain crowd-like throughout their existence. He probably was not thinking about the Texian army of 1836 as he wrote those words, but they go a long way to explain its behavior. The quotation appeared in his classic 1976 magnum opus, The Face of Battle. In it, Sir John focused less on the commanders and more on the rank and file. Not a bird's eye view, but the experience of combat from the last 100 yards. Many historians have examined the Battle of San Jacinto, but none of them have done so through a Keegan-esque lens. Employing techniques that Sir John pioneered, we will examine the Texian soldier's experience of battle. His Grace, the Duke of Wellington, expressed disdain for insolent scribblers who attempted to describe a battle at which they weren't even present. The history of a battle, he insisted, is not unlike the history of a ball. Some individuals may recollect all the little events which the great result is the battle won or lost, but no individual can recollect the order in which or the exact moment at which they occurred, which makes all the difference as to their value or importance. The accounts of the San Jacinto veterans prove his point. Few combatants could even agree when the battle commenced. M.H. Denham avowed the Texian advance began about 3 o'clock in the evening. Samuel G. Hardaway remembered that it commenced in the afternoon about 3 or 4 o'clock. Yet, in a letter penned only 2 days after the encounter, W.C. Swearingen swore that the rebels launched their attack at 12 o'clock. Of course, in 1836, no one could synchronize his watch to any accepted standard. Consequently, any mention of a specific time is at best an estimate. All that is certain is that historians cannot know the exact time the battle began. Still, consensus is that the engagement opened sometime between 3 and 4:40 p.m. Generals seldom viewed every part of a battlefield, and the men in the ranks saw even less. Many of the participant accounts are highly vivid, but one should remain mindful that the individual had an extremely limited angle of vision. The battlefield itself contributed to the short-sightedness. Indeed, the term battlefield is something of a misnomer if one accepts the definition of field as an open area of land without trees or buildings, end quote. Traditionally, commanders sought open spaces to better maneuver large formations of soldiers. Yet such terrain was unavailable at San Jacinto. Hardwood forest bordered bayous, rivers, creeks, and gullies. Tall coastal grasses at times grew as tall as a man, obscuring the killing ground. The topography favored the Texians and their rifles more than the Mexicans with their muskets. It was also a black powder action. After continuous firing, a dense cloud of smoke obscured the area. 19th century observers called it the fog of battle. A soldier could barely see his entire line, much less the enemy downfield. Veterans recalled the lack, well, there's your fog of battle right there. The veterans recalled the lack of visibility. In a very short time, perhaps a minute, the firing became general, Lieutenant John Pettit Borden reported. Smoke from the cannon and small arms rendered it almost impossible to see the shape or size of our enemy. But we pushed on, pell-mell, helter-skelter. End quote. Now, this is one reason Texians were so eager to close with the enemy. It was difficult to kill those one could not see. Finally, historians should recollect that battles are occasion of acute emotional trauma. It is doubtful that any Texian soldier registered much more than the exhilaration, fright, or terror that engulfed him. He focused far more on self-preservation than keeping a faithful record for posterity. Veterans never recalled the entire ebb and flow of the battle. What lingered in memory were random bits and snatches, glanced at through the battle smoke, unexpected bits of sound, spectacle, or stench, notable for their distinctiveness. There we go. I have to point it at the screen, not y'all. The approach. Topography greatly influenced the battle's outcome. The Texian camp lay in a dense oak grove concealed from the enemy's reconnaissance. Mexicans had ensconced themselves behind breastworks about 3/4 of a mile distant. General Houston knew how difficult it was for even regular soldiers to maintain a dressed line while traversing marshy terrain through waist-high grass. Accordingly, he chose a formation more conducive to the maintenance of order. French-Canadian physician Nicolas Labadie recalled that the men formed into twin parallel lines and moved out in single file, now just beyond their camp, right across the ferry road, which is pretty much where it runs now. You know, the road that runs past the Monument Inn, that's the historic road. I know that because we had lunch at the Monument Inn today. Have you eaten there? That's a good place. But I digress. Just beyond their camp, the men sank into a hollow created by runoff drainage. We passed over a depression of ground for half a mile. George B. Erath recounted, where a rise in front of the Mexican line hid us from them. W.C. Swearingen also noted the importance of this terrain feature. Opposite the woods, about 300 yards in their front, was a low hollow that protected us from their cannon, end quote. John S. Menifee wrote the following concerning this crucial terrain feature. We marched up a hollow, or drain, in the prairie in front of the enemy, and probably 300 or 400 yards distance from them, and formed a line of battle. Consequently, the rebels were able to approach the Mexican camp unobserved. By the time the men rose out of what Erath called the sink of ground, they were within striking distance of enemy positions. Taking advantage of the cover provided by this natural basin proved a key factor to the eventual outcome of the battle. As we advanced, Joseph Lawrence remembered, the Mexicans, did not see us until we were within 100 yards of them. Santana's private secretary, Ramon Martinez Caro, confirmed Lawrence's recollections. The Texians, he related, succeeded in advancing to within 200 yards of our trenches without being discovered, and from there they spread death and terror in our ranks. Drawing so close to the enemy without attracting his fire boosted Texian confidence. This might not be so bad after all. Once exposed to view, the haste of their movements became critical. They did not have a second to spare, and they knew it. Reaching a small eminence 200 or 300 yards from the Mexicans, Erath recounted, we were ordered to wheel by left into front, which was done and brought us to the top of the hill. Already in parallel files, the Texians quickly deployed from marching files into a line of battle 2 ranks deep. So here's what it would have looked like. You got 2 files of men marching out of the camp, and then they fall into this basin, right? And now they're in this hole in the ground. And the nanosecond they come out of it, the order column left is given, and then they hurry down to form a line of battle. The twin sisters are in the middle of the line, so all the twin sisters have to do is face toward the enemy. Now this, even Sam Houston said, was done with alacrity, okay? So, by the time the Mexicans saw them, they had come to play. Even General Houston, who was frequently critical of the enlisted men's lack of discipline, was pleased to see how well the troops carried out this maneuver. Every evolution was performed with alacrity, he boasted. It had to be, with his soldiers now visible and, quote, without any protection whatsoever. Speed was critical. Numerous secondary accounts assert that in his hubris, Santana neglected to place sentries around his camp, and consequently the Texians achieved complete surprise. Both of these claims are false. Santana referenced the Texians surprising his advanced guard and the 3 chosen companies that guarded the woods on our right. So he had guards out. He really did, notwithstanding what some people will tell you. Earlier accounts notwithstanding, His Excellency was not quite the bungler that some chroniclers have maintained he was. He did post sentries. That they failed to observe and report the Texian approach owed more to it disappearing into the depression of ground than any Mexican military malfeasance. When Houston's files rose out of the hollow, they were already within rifle range of the Mexican barricades. Most secondary treatments asserted that Texians so surprised the Mexicans that they became demoralized and offered little resistance. Santana's account suggests otherwise. Now, this is what Santana himself says. Although the evil was done. Now, what's the evil talking about? The Texian line being so close. I thought for a minute that it might be repaired. I ordered the permanent battalion of Aldama to reinforce that of the Matamoros, which was sustaining the line of battle and hurriedly organized an attack column under the orders of Colonel Manuel Cespedes, composed of the permanent battalion of Guerrero and detachments from Toluca and Guadalajara, which simultaneously with the column of Colonel Luelmo marched to check the principal advance of the enemy. Have you ever heard of this before? Yeah, I hadn't either. His Excellency described quickly organizing 2 assault columns that sallied beyond the makeshift barricades to counterattack the Texian advance. Discussions of this Mexican counterattack are notably absent from the secondary literature. Frank X. Tolbert did not mention it in the day of San Jacinto. That was way back in 1959. Nor did Archie P. McDonald in the Trail to San Jacinto in 1982. Nor did James W. Pohl in the Battle of San Jacinto, that is 1989. Now, they were not alone. I also overlooked this important drive twice. The first occasion was in Texian Iliad, a military history of the Texas Revolution in 1994, and again in the Alamo 1836, Santana's Texas Campaign 2001. It is curious that so many historians missed this episode. Perhaps they glossed it over because they doubted Santana's veracity or simply because it failed to comport with conventional wisdom. One might forgive earlier historians for doubting Santana's reliability. When attempting to cover his blunders, he was notorious for stretching the truth. Yet at least 2 Texian accounts corroborated his description of the Mexican counterattack. The first appeared in Henry Stuart Foote's Texas and Texans, or Advance of the Anglo-Americans to the Southwest. Now, that was published in 1841. This 2-volume treatment offered one of the first serious studies of the 1836 rebellion. Foote interviewed or corresponded with numerous participants and provided reports of the battle that appear nowhere else. One of the San Jacinto veterans Foote interrogated was Thomas J. Rusk. The former Secretary of War recollected, during the Battle of San Jacinto, when the 1st Texas Regiment of Infantry and the regulars had advanced within about 100 yards of the breastworks of the enemy, a charge was made by a division of the Mexicans, or the Mexican infantry, which we drove back briskly. No, I'm sorry. I got ahead of myself. 100 yards of the breastworks of the enemy. A charge was made by a division of the Mexicans under the command of Colonel Cespedes, I think. That's what he said, I think. And he was right. It was Colonel Cespedes. On our artillery, which was at that time a little in the advance. Tejano patriot Juan Seguin also noted the enemy advance. And this is what he said. My company was in the left wing under Colonel Sidney Sherman. We marched out into the prairie and were met by a column of the Mexican infantry, which we drove back briskly. Before following in with that column, we had dispersed an ambuscade that had opened their fire at us within pistol shot. So here are two Texians talking about that Mexican counterattack. Since both Rusk and Seguin, whom most historians accept as reliable witnesses, mentioned the counterattack, there is little reason to question that it occurred. Recently discovered documents lend further credence for the Mexican drive. On April 8, 2017, Dr. Greg Dimmick, the Dean of Mexican Army Scholars, addressed the 17th Annual Battle of San Jacinto Symposium. During his presentation, he revealed that 10 years after the battle, Manuel Cespedes filed a report in which he described the counterattack he led. General Vicente Fiasola included Cespedes' report as an addendum to his memories of the war against Texas. Dr. Dimmick also, now this is cool, Dr. Dimmick also discovered Cespedes' service record down in Mexico, which verified, quote, in the disgraceful action at San Jacinto, he commanded the column that attacked the enemy. The majority of the officers in his battalion were lost. He had a severe wound in his left arm and was taken prisoner on the same field of battle, end quote. If that were not evidence enough, recent battleground archaeology supports the claim in Cespedes' service record. A dig uncovered a Guerrero Battalion breastplate near the stone marker that indicates where General Houston received his ankle wound. At first, the artifact's location puzzled archaeologists. Why would any member of the Guerrero Battalion have been so far in front of the Mexican barricades? Yet, if one recalls that Colonel Cespedes commanded the Guerrero Battalion and elements of that unit made up the assault column, the answer becomes obvious. What was Santana thinking? Was he willing to sacrifice Cespedes and Luelmo's formations to buy time for his dozy soldados to rally? Did he really believe the columns could barrel forward like battering rams and shatter the Texian line? If the latter, it revealed what a poor student of tactics His Excellency really was. On the Iberian Peninsula, and again at Waterloo, the pattern repeated itself with numbing regularity. The French column always faltered before a steady British line. The explanation was a matter of simple arithmetic. Only the front and outside men along the column's flanks could fire with any degree of effectiveness. Raw recruits trapped deep inside the walking box never removed their muskets from their shoulders. There would have been no reason to. They could not even see the enemy, much less bring their muskets to bear. Conversely, every British redcoat could and did unleash their fire at short range. For the hapless French infantrymen, the effect was like walking into a buzzsaw. The familiar scenario played out again at San Jacinto, except there the result was even more ruinous, since many of the Texians fired long rifles that had far more range and accuracy than the Mexican muskets did. The weight of lead landing on the columns would have been brutal. Most of the Mexican soldiers inside them fell, killed, or wounded in a matter of minutes. They never advanced far enough to present a serious threat, and the concentrated fire of the Texian line quickly eliminated what little hazard they had posed. Another canard of the battle is that Mexican resistance crumbled almost immediately. That certainly was not the memory of John M. Swisher. It will not do to say that the Mexicans were cowardly and would not fight, he insisted. They fought long and well. They commenced firing upon us at the distance of 400 yards, which is kind of pitiful when you consider that the Brown Bess musket has a maximum effective range of 70 yards. That's what he says, at 400 yards. And kept it up incessantly until we had scaled their breastworks. Many of them stood and battled until their brains were dashed out with clubbed guns. George Erath had this to say on the subject. I believe the Mexican soldiers we encountered that day were much braver than they have ever been credited with being. No one has ever disputed the bravery of their officers. Creed Taylor remembered it much the same way. The Mexicans were not cowards, and for a time fought desperately. However, as the onslaught increased and the Texans became more desperate, the foe lost spirit and fell back, finally running toward the center of their encampment, where their brave officers tried to rally them to their colors. I'm going to take a drink. Yeah, that's better. Many of the veterans recounted that during the battle, their fatigue bordered on exhaustion. In the days leading up to the battle, each rebel infantryman had marched under the weight of weapon and pack. Marching at a normal pace, a man could march about 15 miles a day. Yet during the march toward Harrisburg, the Army covered some 60 miles in 2 days. Yeah, let that sink in. An impressive feat for seasoned regulars, much less volunteer militia. That these men maintained such a breakneck pace demonstrated their eagerness to encounter the foe. As Alexander Horton affirmed, there was not time to be lost as the enemy was at the door. The pace levied an aching toll. By April 21st, the date of the main battle, most had not fully recovered. Once in combat, however, many Texians seemed to have experienced an adrenaline rush. In a letter to his father written soon after the battle, John W. Hassell described his feelings. I had a first-rate rifle, and about this time I was using her, sir, with all my might. She run about 40 to the pound and shot first-rate. Now, when Hassell says she shot 40 to the pound, what he's talking about is that you could mold 40 bullets out of 1 pound of lead. So 30 to the pound, so that's what he's talking about. I took notice to some of the big yellow bellies, and when Betsy would bore a hole into them, the claret would gush out as large as a cornstalk. One big fellow, I remember, who I shot in the neck, and it appeared that it had cut his head clear off. I shot old Betsy 6 times and a large holster pistol 1 time. Of the 7 shots, I know that I killed 4. That thing I know. As I have stated about my pistol, I shot that fellow in the left eye. Though it may appear strange to you, but not less stranger than true, it seemed to do me more good at that time to throw a shot or a bayonet through them than anything I have ever yet seen, and it appeared to be the prevailing feeling or sentiment. Well, sir, I must tell you that when we got so near to them as to shake hands, they couldn't bear that. They appeared rather bashful at such a meeting as that, and turned their backs to us, and the rest of the way off about that time we were slaying them like cornstalks. He seems to be fixated with this cornstalk image. I don't entirely understand it, but there you are. Now, again, this is a letter written just within days of the battle. So one can only hope that Hassell fought under the effects of adrenaline, or one might suspect that he took a tad too much pleasure in his work. Once the adrenaline subsided, most soldiers experienced acute weariness. The Mexican cavalry broke in disorder, James Washington Winter recalled, while ours was hotly pursuing them. One of the avenging horsemen, Joseph Lawrence, recalled the chase. For the first 6 miles, they ran very even. I think I've got a slide on this. Yes. For the first 6 miles, they ran. They ran very even and kept out of our reach. But after that, we gained on them and shot our carbines at them, dropping them off of their horses. We then used our holster pistols and long knives, end quote. He then described the sensation when the killing ended and the adrenaline wore off. At the end of 12 miles, we all dropped to rest and let our horses rest. When we dismounted, we were so fatigued that we could not stand up and fell around like a company of drunken men, which is exactly what doctors will tell you that happens when adrenaline runs off. As that old ranger, pioneer, and early printer, John Henry Brown remarked, "The sun of San Jacinto rose in splendor and went down in blood." The savagery with which Texians assaulted the Centralist camp and their refusal to accept the surrender of Mexican soldiers had become an accepted part of the battle's lore. John Hassell was not the only man on the field who relished the carnage. Robert Hancock Hunter recounted the instructions of one Texian officer when General Houston gave orders to take prisoners. "Boys," Lieutenant William Mosby Eastland told them, "take prisoners. You know how to take prisoners. Take them with the butt of your guns," and said, "Remember the Alamo, remember La Bahia, and club guns right and left and knock their brains out." Colonel John Austin Wharton rode along the banks of Peggy Lake where Texians were shooting soldados floundering in the murky waters. Sergeant William Swearingen described the scene. "It was nothing but a slaughter." They first attempted to swim the bayou, but were surrounded by our men, and they shot everyone that attempted to swim the bayou as soon as he took to the water. And them that remained they killed as fast as they could load and shoot them. William Foster Young told a similar story. "We drove them into a marsh, and I sat there on my horse and I shot them until my ammunition gave out. Then I turned the butt of my musket and started knocking them in the head." Witnessing the carnage, Wharton ordered the men to cease firing. Yet Private James Dixon rejoined, "Colonel Wharton, if Jesus Christ were to come down from heaven and order me to quit shooting yellow bellies, I wouldn't do it, sir." I've always liked that "sir." With that, Dixon cocked his rifle, daring Wharton to enforce his orders. Sergeant Moses Austin Bryan, who observed this test of wills, later chronicled, "Wharton, very discreetly, I always thought, turned his horse and left." I think that he was probably wise to do so. Numerous San Jacinto veterans described Texian atrocities that shocked and appalled them. Sergeant Bryan came across a Mexican drummer boy with 2 broken legs. The frightened child grabbed a Texian soldier around his legs, all the while screaming, "Hail Mary, most pure, for God's sake, save my life." I translated it for you. He said it in Spanish. The sergeant begged the man to spare the lad, but the pitiless brute, in a threatening gesture, placed a hand on his belt pistol. Bryan backed off, held his breath, and gazed in horror as the man, quote, blew out the boy's brains. Now, this is a drummer boy. This is a child. Dr. Nicholas Labadie witnessed a cold-blooded murder. He found an enemy officer bogged to his knees in Peggy Lake. "Oh, I know him," one of Captain Seguin's rancheros remarked. "He is Colonel Batras of San Antonio de Bexar." The doctor had just extended his hand to help Batras when he observed the approach of several menacing Texians. "Don't shoot, don't shoot," Labadie cried. "I have taken him prisoner." Notwithstanding the surgeon's pleas, a man fired at point-blank range. The physician recoiled as Bottress's brains splattered his hand and clothing. The villainous deed was bad enough, but Labadie lamented that he had, quote, "witnessed acts of cruelty which I forbear to recount." The imagination reels when it considers just what those acts may have been. But it is known that several of the soldados, the dead soldados, found on the field had been scalped. One hopes after they were dead. The actual battle may have lasted only 18 minutes. It didn't. It was longer than that. I know everybody says that. But I wish they'd quit it. It's not true. But the carnage continued much longer. Pitiless Texians dispatched enemy wounded out of hand. Appalled Colonel Pedro Delgado denounced the atrocities he witnessed that day. That evening, after the battle had ended, his captors were goading him toward the area set aside for POWs. Quote, "These savages struck with their bayonets our wounded soldiers lying on the way," he protested. "Others followed them, consummated the sacrifice with a musket or pistol shot." End quote. In a killing frenzy, some Texian regulars mistook the wounded Alfonso Still for a Mexican and tried to bayonet him. If the 22-year-old artilleryman Tom Green had not intervened, they would have done so. The butchery he witnessed that day haunted George Erath. Even years later, he admitted, quote, "I do not like to dwell on those scenes." Neither did most Texas historians. Most conceded that Texians yielded to a butchering indignation, but failed to consider their psychology. Few soldiers ever fought with a greater sense of grievance. Looking back on the battle as an old man, James Monroe Hill revealed, "In answer to our yell, 'Remember the Alamo, remember La Bahia,' the Mexicans would say, 'Me no Alamo, me no La Bahia.' But the memory of those recent butcheries were too fresh in our minds, and the excitement of the occasion was not such to arouse our sympathy. In an April 10th, 1836, now this is before the battle, just a few days before the battle, Giles Albert Giddings explained his provocation. The enemy's course has been the most bloody that has ever been recorded on the page of history. Our garrison at San Antonio was taken and massacred. Another detachment of 700, commanded by Colonel Fannin and posted at La Bahia, after surrendering prisoners of war, were led out and shot down like beasts. End quote. That would have been enough to induce the ire of Texian soldiers, but during Santana's advance through the settlements, they had witnessed their homes burned, their crops laid waste, and their loved ones made refugees. Private Giddings continued, In their course, the Mexicans show no quarter to age, sex, or condition. All are massacred without mercy. If such conduct is not sufficient to arouse the patriotic feelings of the Sons of Liberty, I know not what will. Private John Menifee claimed it was useless for the Mexicans to stand against men who were fighting with such fury and desperation, for all they held dear on earth, country, fathers and mothers, sisters, brothers, wives, and children, and sweethearts. Erath might have spoken for all of them. We would have fought the whole world then. Many of the company commanders fanned the flames of malevolence. Mosley Baker's pre-battle speech made such a lasting impression on Private Menifee that he later constructed it from memory. Remember, you are fighting an enemy who gives no quarter, and that regards neither age nor sex. Recollect that your homes are destroyed. Imagine your wives and daughters trudging in the mud and water, and your children crying for bread. And then remember that the author of all this woe is within a short distance of us, that the arch fiend is now within our grasp, and that the time has come at last for us to avenge the blood of our fallen heroes and to teach the haughty dictator that Texans cannot be conquered and that they can and will be free. Then nerve yourselves for the battle, knowing that our cause is just and we are in the hands of an all-wise Creator. And as you strike the murderous blows, that's an interesting adjective, isn't it? The murderous blows. Let our watchwords be, remember Goliad, remember the Alamo. Standing in ranks behind Baker's men was Captain Robert James Calder's company. That plain-spoken officer knew that he could never match Baker's oratorical eloquence, and so simply told his men to avail yourself of Captain Baker's supremacy and make the efforts double. Major Coleman also affirmed the enthusiasm of Texas soldiers before the battle. I have never seen sober men animated to the same degree. Now, another reason was at play: fear. The soldiers knew how exhausted, discouraged, and low on supplies they really were. Near the end of their tether, they were unsure how much longer they could sustain their efforts. They needed to complete the job today because tomorrow they might not be able to. Captain Jesse Billingsley explained the thoughts of many. Having but scanty clothing, and many of us without shoes, and our property gone, we were naturally eager for the fight, knowing that nothing but victory could save us. Nothing but victory could save us. And the chance of that was diminishing every day, and feeling that we must soon give out. And to crown the whole, our confidence in General Houston's intention of coming to an engagement was becoming weaker every day. So Sam Houston wasn't real popular among the rank and file. Early in the battle, the Texians gained momentum and dared not lose it. Once Santana's division had become, in Colonel Delgado's words, a bewildered and panic-stricken herd, they sensed the battle was going their way. Nevertheless, they were also aware that the impetus could shift in a heartbeat. If routed soldados could rally long enough to form a battle line, they might deliver a devastating series of volleys that could turn the tide. So ruthless rebels did not give them a chance to stand. They swept forward, killing all they encountered. As First Lieutenant Robert Stevenson told it, we kept up the pursuit until night. Now let me say that again. We kept up the pursuit until night. So much for that 18 minutes poppycock. Scarcely one escaped. About 500 is said to have been killed, end quote. The best way to assure victory involved pressing the enemy when they were at their most disconcerted and disjointed, at the pinnacle of psychological distress. Far from standing fast and exchanging volleys, Houston's company commanders deployed their men as shock troops. Texians attacked with such ferocity that the Mexicans broke and fled in, quote, irreparable disorder. Texian soldiers expressed contempt for the Mexican spirit, but respected Mexican numbers. Battles such as Concepcion, the storming of Bayard, had taught the rebels that they could prevail against a superior force. Yet the Alamo had also reminded them that if they had overwhelming numbers, Mexicans could, overwhelm smaller numbers of Texians, even if they were ensconced behind stout walls in strong defensive positions. The rebels, who had watched General Casas' reinforcements arrive on the field that morning, understood that they would be fighting at numerical disadvantage. To even the odds, they needed to kill as many of the enemy as possible, as quickly as possible. William S. Taylor affirmed disparity of numbers was much on his mind as his unit rode after the retreating Mexican cavalry. This is what he said. As there were but some 15 or 18 of us and some 60 of the Mexicans we were pursuing, he allowed, we saw it was impossible for us to take prisoners. He hastened to add, however, we had but little disposition to do so, knowing they had slaughtered so many of Fannon's men in cold blood. Major Coleman also left a vivid account of Texian mounted riflemen and their disinclination to take prisoners. The Texian cavalry, at an early part of the action, saw General Santana at the head of the Mexican horse take flight and immediately pursued them, as the Texian horses were far superior than those of the Mexicans. Their rear was soon reached when a general slaughter was commenced. When quarter was demanded, the answer was, "Remember the Alamo," and the victim was immediately dispatched. As they swept through the enemy camp, Texians were unwilling to halt for anybody or anything. Surging forward, they either could not or else refused to heed, which I think is more likely, the orders of their officers. Revengeful soldiers were beyond discipline, beyond control. Near the end of the battle, General Houston ordered a ceasefire, asserting, "Glory enough has been gained this day, and blood enough has been shed." Yet Secretary of War Thomas Jefferson Rusk rode up just then. Having overheard Houston's order to stand down, he immediately countermanded it. Glory enough is not, nor will not be won, or blood enough shed while the enemy continues to fight. Your order, General, cannot be obeyed. So the carnage continued. You see, it took time to take prisoners. Time the attackers did not allow defenders lest they employ it to rally. Moreover, soldiers must tend prisoners. Dead enemies require no supervision. Had Texians taken to the rear every Mexican who attempted to surrender, the rebel army would have disappeared. Now that's just a fact. Mexicans who attempted to surrender now check that. Now we teach our kids that it is disgraceful to kick opponents when they're down, right? Yet war is not sport. In a life and death struggle, the best time to press an enemy is when he is overwhelmed and demoralized. Mean-spirited? Possibly. Effectual? Completely. Indeed, most battles of annihilation illustrate this principle. It sounds atrocious when one says it out loud. The Texian soldiers at San Jacinto were wise to maintain the pressure. Yet to do so, they could not halt their onslaught to take prisoners. Killing fleeing soldados was therefore practical, prudent, and proper under those particular circumstances. And if that's not alliteration enough for you, I'll try to do better next time. The bloodshed would have been greater had it not been for the deportment of Colonel Juan N. Almonte. A member of Santana's staff, he attempted to rally fleeing soldados and organize some kind of resistance. Yet they were too shattered to notice his commands. Almonte survived his swim across Peggy Lake. Most of his fellow Mexicans did not. Once on the opposite bank, the dripping officer assembled the devastated men who remained. He had observed that vengeful Texians were refusing to accept the surrender of individual Mexicans. However, they might spare a cohesive unit. Therefore, he arranged the remnants of the Guerrero Battalion into dressed ranks. At the close of the fight, Thomas Jefferson Rusk testified, and just after sundown, Colonel Almonte came out of the woods and surrendered with about 250 men. There were at that place not exceeding 10 or 15 Americans, end quote. Approaching the Mexican officer, who was clearly in charge of the unit, Rusk said, "You must be Colonel Almonte." The colonel replied, "You speak well." Then, as Rusk related, I rode up to him and gave him my hand, saying to him, "It affords me great pleasure to see you, Colonel." With great presence of mind and with his customary politeness, Almonte responded, "The pleasure is reciprocal." This account prompts a question. Did the Texians accept Almonte's surrender because the Mexicans were in formation, or because it might have proven tricky for 15 Texians to kill 250 enemies? Whatever the reason, the example of these two decent men cooled the Texians' killing frenzy and restored a level of humanity to the battlefield. Now that's when the Battle of San Jacinto ended, my friends. That was a lot longer than 18 minutes. Referencing Waterloo accounts, Sir John observed the following. What sticks in the forefront of survivors' memories is combat itself, their own and their comrades' behavior, the actions of the enemy and the effects of the weapons they face. Is it possible, from the reams of testimony they have left, to discern in these dozens of transient individual experience any pattern of human activity, any concrete reality of battle in this, the apogee of black powder warfare? Even to begin to do so requires that we separate out the various categories of man versus man and man versus weapon encounters, which went to make up the totality of the conflict. In terms of its strategies and tactics, the Texas Revolution continued Napoleonic systems. Therefore, one is wholly justified to employ Keegan's methodology to comprehend the battle and the men who fought it. Cavalry versus mounted riflemen. Of all the branches in the Mexican army, Texians feared the cavalry most, and for good reason. These guys knew what they were doing. In the skirmish on April 20th, Mexican regular cavalry had countered Sidney Sherman's unit of Texian horse and forced them off the field. In that action, the Mexicans came dangerously close to killing or capturing Secretary of War Thomas J. Rusk, I should say. Indeed, they would have, if not for the quick action and steady valor of Private Mirabeau be Lamar. On April 21st, General Houston placed his mounted force on the far right of his line. He worried about the enemy's lancers. Had they been able to strike the Texian right, they might have rolled up the Texian line like a tortilla. Consequently, Houston deployed his horsemen, now under the command of Lamar, who had jumped to the rank of colonel overnight. Where but the Texian army could that happen? As a screen. Santana had at his disposal only medium cavalry in the form of dragoons / lancers. For his part, Houston possessed no regular cavalry at all. One might best describe Texian horse as mounted riflemen, men who could and did fight from horseback or on foot. Fortunately for the Texian horsemen, the Mexican cavalrymen, the same force that had proven so formidable only the day before, failed to offer any security on April 21st. Two factors clarify the feebleness of the Mexican cavalry on that day. Around 4 o'clock p.m., Santana had his men, who had stood on alert all day and throughout the previous night, stand down. And it really irritates me when I hear people say, well, we won that battle because the Mexicans took a siesta. Now, what's not said is, now ain't that just like a Mexican? Now, I want you to understand something about these Mexican soldados. They had marched from New Washington on the 20th. They had fought a battle. They had been up all night because they were expecting a night attack. Casas' men had marched all night. They had been on the alert all day. And finally, about 4 o'clock, Santana's officers came to him and said, look, General, our men are dead on their feet. If the Texians have an attack now, they ain't gonna. Can we stand the men down? And he said, yeah, stand the men down. So these guys were walking zombies. And we've already heard some of the Texians commend their bravery. So to dismiss these honorable soldiers by saying, well, they took a siesta. They didn't take a siesta. They were dead on their feet. Just pisses me off when I hear people say that. The Mexican mounts were as exhausted as their riders, who removed saddles and bridles for a well-deserved breather. Colonel Delgado recalled, our cavalry were riding bareback to and from water. Having seen to the needs of their horses, the cavalrymen collapsed into their bedrolls. The rebels launched their attack with such suddenness that the Mexican cavalrymen did not have sufficient time to saddle their horses and mount up. By the time they did, the rebel line had disintegrated and the enemy was pouring through the camp. In a second, we were into them with guns, pistols, and bowie knives, recalled Private Walter P. Lane. In a short time, they were running like turkeys, whipped and discomfited, end quote. Major Coleman related that the Mexicans retreated in, quote, irreparable disorder. Those Mexican cavalrymen that rebels did not kill on the spot sprang onto their mounts and fled. Vengeful Texians did not allow them to reorganize and countercharge. Lamar was encouraged to observe the Mexican cavalrymen fleeing the field. Nevertheless, he had to ensure that they did not regroup and return to wreak the kind of havoc they had the day before. He therefore ordered his mounted riflemen to pursue them. As James Washington Winter, Joseph Lawrence, Robert N. Coleman, and M.H. Denham recounted, they continued to pursue for several miles and with considerable mayhem. Consequently, on April 21st, the impact of the dreaded Mexican cavalry was insignificant. Artillery played a negligible role in the April 21st battle. Only 3 pieces graced the field. The twin sisters employed by the Texians and El Volcan, the volcano, employed by the Mexicans. Both commanding generals and the gunners themselves would have preferred to implement their artillery more than they did. Yet in both cases, the behavior of Texian infantry thwarted them. The 25-year-old Ben McCullough, one of the gunners manning the twin sisters, left a brief but revealing explanation. We commenced firing at 210 paces from the enemy's breastworks and kept in advance of our line until we were less than 100 paces from the enemy. When they gave way and were pursued by us 250 paces from the breastworks. But, and here's the key point, but we were prevented firing by our own men who had outstripped us in the race. George Erath corroborated McCullough's account. Quote, he's talking about the Mexicans, their cannon had been taken and passed, he recollected. Ours had ceased firing because we were too closely mixed with the Mexicans. Texian gunners appeared to have directed their fire against battlefield obstacles. As Alfred Kelso of Captain William Hurd's company reported, quote, our cannonading soon knocked their breastworks to pieces, and we were ordered to charge. The twin sisters only fired a few times. It was not more because, as McCullough and Erath confirmed, the charging Texian infantry obscured their field of fire. No longer able to fire their cannon without striking their own men, the gunners abandoned them, joined the charge, and fought the rest of the day as infantry. Likewise, the dash of Texian infantry denied El Volcan a more momentous part in the battle. Moses Austin Bryan recorded that Mexican gunners fired at us twice. That's it, twice. Although the cannon was filled with a third load when captured. Texians dashed lightning-like, overwhelmed their position, and captured their ordnance. It is impossible to determine how many of the 11 Texians killed and the 30 wounded fell to El Volcan. Yet the gun almost certainly claimed one fatality. Riding 40 yards in front of its bore, General Houston's gray stallion, Saracen, fell lifeless, having been pierced with 5 balls. For all 5 rounds to have landed at once, they had to have been fired from one of El Volcan's canisters. The twin sisters' greatest contribution may have been more psychological than physical. Private John W. Swisher recalled their effect on the Texian morale. It has been said that artillery in an open field, such as we had at San Jacinto, does not do much execution. That it, like lightning, rarely ever strikes a man, although when it does strike, it's nearly certain to kill. But the thunder of their roar is very potent in scaring the wits out of the enemy, and is worth 10 bands of martial music in inspiring the troops. This I saw demonstrated fully at the Battle of San Jacinto, end quote. San Jacinto's greatest killers were Texian infantrymen who inflicted the vast majority of Mexican casualties. Students of the battle have acknowledged the lethality of Houston's foot soldiers, but most have failed to consider the reasons. The Texians achieved tactical surprise, but most studies exaggerated the degree to which they caught the Mexicans unaware. Numerous accounts mentioned the heavy fire encountered during the rebel advance. In a letter to his relatives, Moses Lapham recalled the intensity of the enemy's musketry. The enemy opened their fire at a distance of 300 or 400 yards, but our men marched on 100 yards further when our officers ordered them to fire. But most of them, especially the Texians, know better the range of their rifle and the military character of their enemy, and rushed eagerly ahead, wholly regardless of the shameful orders of our general and officers, until within 100 yards of the enemy, when they gave a destructive fire, and some of the officers had sense enough to charge, which would have been given, order or no order, and they rushed on like tigers and mounted their breastworks. Quote, the left wing, commanded by Colonel Sherman, were first attacked by heavy fire of musketry from the timber, Colonel Robert Stevenson reported. The center and right wing, commanded by Colonel Burleson and General Houston, marched forward until a discharge of grape and canister from the enemy's artillery in front, which we at last were obliged to charge. Major Coleman confirmed that the Mexicans ensconced in woods, quote, warmly received Sherman's advance. Private John S. Menifee recollected, the enemy opened on us with their cannon and small arms, but we withheld our fire till near enough to do execution and poured it onto them hot and heavy, still continuing to advance, end quote. Likewise, Private Joseph Lawrence corroborated that the Mexicans, quote, fired a terrible volley of small shot at us. But fortunately, they shot over our heads. It seemed at one time that if one had held his hat 2 feet above his head, it would have caught 20 bullets or more. Lawrence was not the only veteran who recalled the heavy but ineffective enemy fusillades. Quote, as the Mexicans shot high, George Erath recollected, nearly all the harm done to us was done during the descent of the hill to the Mexican line, end quote. Alfred Kelso recollected that the Mexicans overshot us with their muskets. Moses Austin Bryan also described hearing Mexican bullets whistling as they overshot us. Finally, Private Swisher attributed the ineffectiveness of Mexican fire to supernatural forces. This is what he said. During the charge, the air seemed to be full of hissing bullets. Many of them passed overhead, many struck the ground in front, and many flitted by the ears of the soldiers, almost scorching them. It really seemed as if some invisible hand had turned them aside, he contended. The God of battles fought with Joshua. Why may he not have fought with Sam Houston? He inquired. Shooting at the skies, that's what they called it. Shooting at the skies was a practice not limited to the Mexican army. Firing high was the inevitable consequence when any rattled soldiers fired too quickly. Napoleon forbade rifles in his ranks because the men took too long to load them. Ironically, officers complained that troops in the heat of battle tended to fire their smoothbore muskets too quickly. The object, after all, was not simply to load and fire faster than the enemy, but to land lead on target. The result of such hasty and subsequently harmless volleys tended to embolden rather than discourage those on the receiving end. Judging by Lawrence and Kelso's accounts, this appears to have happened at San Jacinto. Far from exhorting speed, experienced officers tried to steady their men and, if required, actually slow the frequency of fire. They made sure the rank and file took time to level their muskets correctly before giving the command to fire. Texian veterans confirmed that the Mexicans unleashed, quote, a terrible volley of small shot, quote, which refutes the total surprise fallacy. Even so, they also verify that all those shots produced, quote, no result. Finally, one must attribute the ineptness of the Mexican volleys to three factors: firing beyond effective range, poorly trained soldados loading and firing their muskets with careless haste, and their officers neglecting to regulate the rate of fire, all of which redounded to the benefit of the Texians. General Houston envisioned a more traditional battle, one in which lines fired, reloaded, and advanced at a walk. Yet such tactics would have slowed the pace of the battle. During the time required to halt and reload, the Mexicans could have rallied behind their barricades and returned concentrated rifle fire. As the Texian line dissolved into clusters of shock troops, the soldados had no main body against which they could direct their fire. Quote, once the order to charge was given and the furious fight began, Creed Taylor began, all semblance of order had ceased. The respective commanders were simply unable to direct or control their men. Even the commander-in-chief himself was virtually a private, end quote. Ellis Benson told how Houston, quote, hallooed at the top of his voice to the men to halt, but they would not listen, and on they swept upon the enemy, end quote. James Monroe Hill explained how after the Texians' initial volley, quote, a general stampede ensued. After this, every man in our army, so far as I was able to judge, was his own commander, end quote. By that stage of the battle, the general's orders were as irrelevant and unheeded as his soldiers were defiant and foul-smelling. Company commanders were unwilling to stand in ranks and wait for the enemy's fire to improve. Kelso spoke plainly. We were ordered to charge, but it was also clear that those orders did not come from General Houston. Once the Texians abandoned their line and pushed forward toward the barricades, they gained the momentum and never let it go. First Lieutenant Robert Stevens recalled his unit rushed forward with great impetuosity, jumped the enemy's breastworks, the Alamo being our war cry, took possession of their artillery and drove them from their position. As M.H. Denham described it, their whole line gave way and a scene of slaughter took place which defied description. Mexican accounts tell the same story. Meeting no resistance, Colonel Delgado lamented, the Texians dashed lightning-like upon the deserted camp. Some riflemen, like John W. Hassel, fought at Hunters. They marked their man, aimed, and brought him down, later being able to recall specific details of each kill. To assist rapid firing, James Monroe Hill testified that the men in his unit carried rifle balls in our mouth. Many, frustrated by the rifle's slow rate of fire, employed them as bludgeons. A solid sheet of flame flashed from our rifles, Taylor recounted. And then, without waiting to reload, we bore down and closed in upon the surprised and frightened enemy with clubbed guns, pistols, and hunting knives, end quote. Charles B. Shane recalled our men either threw away their guns or used them as clubs. Another veteran recalled the tactics' damaging impact on their rifles. We having no bayonets, he explained, we used the butt end of our muskets and rifles like war clubs of the Indians, many paying for it by having their shooting irons break off at the breech. An unidentified correspondent to a New York newspaper later described the battleground littered with Mexican skulls, hundreds of them, he wrote, which the Texian soldiers had, quote, mashed in with the, quote, breeches of their guns. Like Taylor, many veterans also mentioned the use of knives. English travel writer Charles Houghton related a terrible incident. I have no, I guess not. But this is what Houghton says. I have heard it stated that a blow from one well-wounded bowie knife is sufficient to break a man's arm. Certain it is that I have myself seen skulls of the Mexicans brought from the battleground of San Jacinto that were cleft nearly through the thickest part of the bone behind, evidently at one blow, with sufficient force to throw out extensive cracks like those of starred glass. this is what it would have looked like. Now, any Columbos in the audience? What is significant about this wound coming from behind? He is either fleeing or he's not resisting. This is a gang style sort of execution. If that's what happens. One may well believe Houghton's account when one considers the size and heft of the weapon. Another English visitor described its effectiveness as a cleaver. The real Bowie knife has a two-edged blade, about 9 inches long, slightly curved toward the point, and sufficiently thick in the back to serve as a chopper, in which way it was formidable, but not so much as in thrusting. German immigrant Gustav Dressel knew many veterans of the battle and related that they told him the Bowie knife, he recounted, reaped a destructive and horrible harvest among the Mexicans who were begging for mercy. They were literally slaughtered, Dressel said. An anonymous correspondent praised the behavior of Captain Juan Seguin's company. In a dispatch he published in the Richmond Enquirer, one Tejano, he reported, quote, with a Bowie knife killed 25 of his countrymen. Now, many modern-day academics view such claims with considerable skepticism. Shielded in their climate-controlled classrooms, offices, and faculty lounges, they simply cannot imagine the horrors of a 19th century battlefield. It is, as Professor Keegan observed, direct, face-to-face, knock-down and drag-out violence is something which modern middle-class Western man encounters rarely, if at all, in his everyday life. Recall, however, that frontiersmen had more occasion to use blades. They routinely field-dressed game and slaughtered livestock. For men habituated to blood and viscera, slitting a man's throat or cleaving his skull would have been no more taxing than slaughtering a November hog. Indeed, if the victims were unarmed and offering little or no opposition, it would have been easier. I delivered this talk on another occasion, and I was criticized by some of the Karens in the audience for showing these slides. They complained that they were distasteful. My students, who are lazy, are always saying, now Dr. Hardin, just what's the takeaway? What's the takeaway? What do we need to know for that? What's the takeaway? I'll tell you the takeaway. The experience of battle at San Jacinto was distasteful. And you know, there are a lot of folks who like to eat venison who don't like to gut the deer. But honest military history talks about gutting the deer too. Is it distasteful? Sure it is. All battles are. But here's the takeaway. The Battle of San Jacinto was more distasteful than most. Perhaps shattered Mexicans believed that if they threw down their muskets and offered no resistance, the Texians would readily accept their surrender. If so, they were mistaken, fatally mistaken. There is no precedent for such fatality as resulted at San Jacinto in all the records of history, one chauvinistic chronicler crowed. That undisciplined, ununiformed little army of frontiersmen set standards of deadly battle which remain as yet without parallel in the annals of history. However, one doleful detail explains the high number of Mexican dead. Most of those killed at San Jacinto were without weapons, trying to surrender and offering no resistance. Texian soldiers did not, quote, set a standard of deadly battle, but vindictive butchery. Under those circumstances, 25 doomed men may well have perished under the Tejano's murderous blade. The chronicler was mistaken in another regard. Such brutality was not without parallel. Military history offers numerous examples of battles of annihilation in which victors claimed payback against defeated enemies for real or imagined atrocities. I mention this not in an attempt to justify the savagery of Texian soldiers, but to stress the horrors of all battlefields. Blood-drenched Texians would have answered that David Crockett and his 4 or 6 companions murdered after the fighting at the Alamo, as well as the 342 prisoners of war gunned down at Goliad, were also helpless and unarmed. It was not, of course, an enlightened or humane justification. Still, the events of the preceding 7 weeks, it was an entirely explicable one. Many soldados proved easy to kill because they were both smaller and weaker than their Texian adversaries were. The average Anglo-American of the period was taller and heavier than the average Mexican. The typical Mexican soldier was less than medium stature, standing about 5 feet 5 inches in height. Yet the service papers revealed desperate officers, or officials, I should say, accepted recruits as short as 5 feet. The Texians were aware of this disparity and eager to take advantage of it. Indeed, Noah Smithwick openly mocked, Mexican troops with their, quote, shriveled little bodies, end quote. Even when the fighting ended, the horror did not. Irish-born John J. Lynn did not participate in the battle, but arrived on the field soon afterwards. What he witnessed there appalled him. This is what he recorded. The ghastly spectacle of 600 Mexican corpses festering in the sun met our gaze. The pockets of every one had been turned in search for plunder. In passing the breastworks, I noticed a man who was extracting the teeth of the dead Mexicans. He was a dentist from the United States and was supplying himself with those valuable adjuncts of his trade. Each veteran's personality determined his battle experience. Some remembered the day with exhilaration, others with pride. Recollecting atrocities committed or witnessed, a handful looked back with horror and shame. The typical San Jacinto veteran was a product of an American militia tradition. He saw himself as a citizen soldier, not a professional. He had no patience for any regular Army claptrap. He was no dupe of the state. He did not fight for procedures, policies, or pay. See, I promised you more alliteration. He did not view himself as a hireling, but as a patriot. His incentives stood over the hearth roasting game he had bagged. Nabbed in the crib he had crafted. Grew on the land he had cleared and planted. And because his priorities were so personal, he gleefully slaughtered all who threatened them. Moreover, he fought as an individual, defending his own interest, regarding killing as a job that needed doing. He pitched in and did it. Then he packed up and went home. Thank you for your attention.